I built the compound over 15 years, and I want you to understand that it was not paranoia that drove it, or at least not the kind of paranoia that people use as a dismissal when they do not want to take something seriously. It was math. I had spent 22 years as a contractor, commercial construction, some residential, a few government projects that taught me things about infrastructure fragility that I was not supposed to take home with me, but did. And what the math told me, consistently, over 2 decades of watching how things were built and why they failed, was that the systems holding modern civilization together were not robust. They were efficient. There is a difference, and it is a significant one. Robust systems have redundancy built in, multiple failure points, the capacity to absorb shock without cascading. Efficient systems are optimized, lean, interconnected, which means when one part fails, a failure does not stay local. It travels. I had been watching the global nuclear infrastructure for years before the Cascade, and what I saw was efficiency without redundancy. Facilities that depended on external power grids to run their own cooling systems. Control networks that have been quietly digitized and networked for cost savings without adequate isolation. A daisy chain of interdependencies that looked fine right up until the moment it did not. So I started with the land. 43 acres in a rural county that I will not name, far enough from any population center to matter, with a natural hill on the eastern edge that I spent 3 years turning into something that looked like nothing from the outside and was everything on the inside. The main structure was built into the hill, reinforced concrete, 8 inches of earthen cover on the roof, passive ventilation with HEPA filtration that I upgraded 3 times over the years as the technology improved. Solar array on the south-facing slope, angled and partially screened by vegetation, so it did not catch the eye from the road or the air. A deep water well, 230 feet, below any surface contamination, with a hand pump backup in case the electric pump failed. Rainwater collection with filtration. A root cellar that I stocked over years with a rotating supply of long-term storage food, canned goods, freeze-dried, grain in sealed buckets, enough caloric density to keep one person fed for 5 years if rationed correctly. A medical bay with supplies I spent a decade accumulating. Antibiotics, surgical tools, reference manuals. Enough to handle most emergencies short of full operating theater. A communication setup that could receive without transmitting. I could hear the world without the world hearing me, which was exactly the arrangement I wanted. I had a workshop, a reloading bench, a library of physical books because I had learned early that digital storage is only as good as the power keeping alive. I had a greenhouse space inside for growing, grow lights on the solar system, seeds stored properly in sealed containers at the right temperature. I had thought about every system and every failure mode and every contingency I could conceive of, and I had built for it. By the time the Cascade hit, I had been living in the compound full-time for 8 months, having sold my business, settled my affairs, and made the decision that the math had finally tipped past the point where staying in the world made sense. I was alone. That was by design. I had been married once, briefly in my 30s, to a woman who understood me well enough to know that she did not want to spend her life with someone whose idea of a weekend project was pouring reinforced concrete. She was not wrong about that. I did not have children. I had a brother in Phoenix who thought I was eccentric, and a handful of former colleagues who thought I was more eccentric than that, and none of them knew where the compound was because I had not told them, and they had not asked in a way that suggested they wanted a real answer. When the Cascade happened, when the cyber attack sequenced through control systems of nuclear facilities across 14 countries in 72 hours, and the meltdowns began, and the radiation maps started changing in ways that the remaining broadcast media could barely keep up with, I was already sealed in, already running on my own systems, already watching through my perimeter cameras and my radio receivers as the world outside began the long process of coming apart. The first weeks were the hardest in a specific way that I had not fully anticipated. I had prepared for the physical reality of the collapse, the logistics, the resource management, the security protocols. What I had not fully reckoned with was the sound of it. The radio traffic in those early weeks was, I do not have a better word for it than human. People looking for family. Emergency coordinators trying to manage situations that were past managing. Broadcasts from local officials in areas that had not yet understood how bad it was going to get. I listened because the intelligence was useful, and I kept listening after it stopped being useful, because silence is its own kind of information. And then the silence came, and I turned the monitoring to a lower frequency check. Twice a day, morning and evening, and I built my routine. Routine is survival. I learned that in the first month, and it became the architecture of my days. I woke at the same time, ran through the same system checks in the same order, maintained the same schedule of tasks, maintenance, inventory, growing, physical training, study. I kept a log. I marked the days. I tracked the external radiation readings from my rooftop sensors and mapped the data in a notebook, watching the livable zone around my property with the same attention a doctor gives to a slowly changing test result. The compound was in a fortunate position geographically, far enough from a nearest fail facility, upwind of the worst contamination corridors, on ground that the readings suggested will remain viable for the foreseeable future. I did not take that for granted. I checked the numbers every day, and I planned for the day they would change. I saw people in the first 6 months. Not many. The road beyond my northern tree line was not a main route, and the area had been sparsely populated before the Cascade. But enough to confirm that the world outside was operating in the way I had expected. Small groups moving, mostly on foot, carrying what they could, heading in directions that suggested they had heard something better was available somewhere else. I watched them through my cameras, and I did not go out, and I did not signal. And I felt the weight of that, and I carried it, and I kept it in its box, because opening that box was the one thing I could not afford to do. A man alone in a compound with finite resources cannot absorb the needs of a world in collapse. That is not cruelty. That is arithmetic. I told myself that every time I watched someone pass on the road. By month 8, the road was empty and had been empty for 6 weeks, and I had adjusted to the emptiness the way you adjust to anything that becomes a new normal. Not without awareness, but without the sharp edge that awareness had carried in the early days. I was alone and I was surviving, and the compound was functioning, and the math was holding. And then on a Tuesday morning in early October, I ran my perimeter camera check, and on the eastern tree line feed, moving slow and careful through the scrub at the edge of my property, I saw something that did not fit any of the patterns I had been cataloging for 2 years. I sat forward in my chair, and I pulled the feed to the main monitor, and I looked at what was moving through my tree line, and I sat there for a long time, without moving and without looking away, in the routine that had been the architecture of my survival cracked straight down the middle, and I felt something I had not felt in 2 years of careful, deliberate, managed solitude. I felt it land in my chest like a stone dropping into still water, and the ripples went out in every direction and did not stop. I want to tell you what I saw on that camera feed in a way that communicates accurately why it stopped me the way it did. And to do that, I need to back up slightly and tell you what I've been seeing on those feeds for 2 years, so that you understand the contrast. What I had been seeing was adults, men mostly, occasionally women, occasionally mixed groups, people who move with particular body language of desperation, hunched, fast, reactive, scanning, people who were surviving moment to moment, and whose every movement communicated that fact. The posture of someone who does not know where their next meal is coming from, or whether the next person they encounter is going to try to take what they have. I knew that posture. I had cataloged it. I understood it. What was moving through my eastern tree line on that October morning was not that. It was small. That was the first thing. Small enough that it took my brain a beat longer than usual to categorize. And it was moving with a deliberateness and a patience that I had not seen in any of the people who had passed on the road in the early months. It was not hurrying. It was not scanning in the reactive way of someone frightened. It was moving through the scrub with methodical attention to cover and sight line that suggested training, or something that had become so habitual it looked like training. And it was carrying a pack, not a scavenge bag, not a pillowcase of grab belongings, a proper pack, fitted and loaded with the weight distribution of someone who had packed it correctly, with items clipped to the exterior in positions that suggested they had been chosen for access rather than convenience. I recognized what I was looking at the way you recognize the work of someone who knows what they're doing, a quality of intention that is visible in the result even when you cannot see the process. Someone had built that pack. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing had built it and put it on this small, careful figure moving through my tree line, and that someone was nowhere in the camera frame and had not been in the camera frame for the full length of the eastern feed, and was not, as best as I could determine in those first minutes, anywhere on my property or approaching it. I switched between cameras for 11 minutes. I checked every feed, every angle, every approach route to my property. I went back to the eastern feed and watched, and I switched again and watched, and I did a full perimeter sweep twice. And then I sat back in my chair and I looked at the eastern feed, and I looked at what was moving to my tree line alone. And I said out loud, to no one, in a compound I had built to keep the world out, what I was not prepared to say and could not avoid saying. That is a child. And moving at the child's heel, visible now as the figure stepped into a clearer section of the tree line, was a small scruffy dog that stopped when the child stopped and moved when the child moved. I sat there and looked at the two of them and felt the arithmetic I had been living by for 2 years start come apart at the seams. I have a protocol for everything. I built my survival architecture around the principle that when something unexpected happens is the worst possible time to make decisions from scratch. So you make them in advance, build them into a protocol, and when the moment comes to execute, and the emotion stays in its box. I had protocols for perimeter breaches, equipment failures, medical emergencies, fire, a dozen other contingencies. I did not have a protocol for a child in my tree line. I acknowledged that and built one on the spot, which is not ideal but was what the situation required. Step 1 was confirmation. I needed to be certain of what I was looking at before I did anything else. Certain the child was alone. Certain this was not a scout or a decoy. Certain that there was not a group of adults using a child as a sympathetic leading edge of an approach. I had read accounts in the early months, from radio traffic and from a few written logs left by travelers that I had retrieved from my road perimeter, of exactly that tactic being used on isolated homesteaders. It was the kind of thing people do when they are desperate enough and have stopped caring about the line between what they will and will not do. So I watched. I pulled every camera feed and watched for 40 minutes without moving and built a picture of a child alone. No movement north or south of her position. Nothing on the road. Nothing on the thermal overlay suggesting concealed bodies. Just a child moving through the eastern scrub with that careful, unhurried patience, and the dog and the pack, and the dosimeter clipped to the strap that told me whoever had sent her out understood the Cascade well enough to equip her for it. I watched her movement pattern for the full 40 minutes, and I want to tell you what I observed because it matters to understanding who she was and where she had come from. She was not wandering. Her line of movement had a direction and a purpose. She was following the tree line rather than cutting across open ground, which is a correct choice in an environment where you do not know who is watching, and she was doing it at a pace that suggested she understood how to conserve energy over distance. She stopped twice in the 40 minutes I watched her, once to check the dosimeter, holding it up and reading it with a matter-of-factness that told me she had been doing this regularly and knew what she was looking at, and once to give the dog water from a collapsible bowl she produced from a side pocket of the pack, and then stowed again with the economy of someone who did not waste motion. That second stop is the one that got me, not the dosimeter check. That was training, skill, preparation. The water stop was something else. She gave the dog its water before she drank herself. She stood in my tree line in a radiation zone 2 years into the end of the world, and she made sure her dog had water, and then she drank, and then she packed the bowl and kept moving. I sat in my chair, and I looked at that on my monitor, and I felt something shift in my chest that I am not going to dress up with better language than what it was. It was the moment the protocol became secondary. I gave it another 10 minutes. I did a final full perimeter sweep, thermal and visual, and confirmed what I had already confirmed. She was alone, and then I sat for a moment more and had a conversation with myself that was brief and not particularly complicated. The compound was built for one. The stores were calculated for one. Every resource equation I had built over 15 years was a one-person equation, and introducing a second person, a child who would need specific things that my stores may or may not have accounted for, altered every one of those equations in ways I had not modeled. That was an argument for staying in my chair. It was a real argument. It was the kind of argument that had kept me alive for 2 years while other people made decisions with their hearts and paid for it. I heard it, and I acknowledged it, and I stood up, and I went to the equipment rack, and I put on my jacket, and I checked my sidearm, and I went to the main door. I had a secondary exit that opened into the natural vegetation on the eastern slope. Not the main gate, which was visible from the road, but concealed ground-level door set into the hillside that I had designed specifically for situations where I needed to move outside without advertising the compound's location. I used it now. Coming out into the October air with the radiation counter on my belt reading in the acceptable range, and the morning light flat and gray through the cloud cover that had been a near-permanent feature of the sky since the Cascade. I moved through my own tree line parallel to the eastern fence, staying in cover. I heard the dog before I saw either of them, a low alert sound, not aggressive. I came around a stand of scrub oak, and there she was, maybe 15 feet away, completely still, watching me with eyes that were assessing and calculating simultaneously. Her hand had moved to the side of her pack, where something was accessible that she knew how to use. She did not reach for it. She watched me. I stopped and I held my hand slightly away from my body, and I said, "I'm not going to hurt you," in the same tone I would use to talk to a spooked animal, calm and even and not loud. She said nothing. The dog was between us, still making that low sound. I said, "You have been in the open a while. Your dosimeter reading. I saw you check it. You need to get inside." She looked at the dog, and the dog had gone quiet, which I noted because a dog's read on a person is not nothing. She said, "How do you know about dosimeters?" I knew from those 5 words, the steadiness, the specific question, the absence of panic, that whoever had raised this child had done something extraordinary. I said, "The same way whoever packed your bag does. Come inside." It took another 10 minutes of careful conversation before she moved. She did not come easily or quickly, and I did not push her, because push was exactly the wrong approach, and I knew it. I answered her questions. She had specific questions, not the questions of a frightened child, but the questions of someone running a threat assessment. And I let her set the pace, and I watched the dog watch me, and when the dog's body language shifted from alert to neutral, I saw her register it, and I saw something in her face shift slightly in response. She trusted the dog's read. That told me something about how they had been traveling together and how long. When she finally moved, it was without ceremony. She just started walking the direction I had indicated, and I fell in beside her at a distance, and we walked through my tree line toward the concealed door without speaking, and the dog moved between us and slightly ahead as if it had appointed itself to the position and intended to keep it. I got her inside. That was the mission, and I had completed it, and I stood in the equipment room just inside the concealed door and looked at her standing in the interior light for the first time and did the inventory that I could not help doing. Her condition, her gear, her effect. She was thin, but not critically. Her clothing was appropriate and layered correctly for the conditions. She was dirty in the way of someone who had been traveling for days, not weeks. Her eyes were clear. She was watching me do the inventory and doing her own in return, and not bothering to pretend otherwise. The dog sat down at her feet and looked up at me with an expression that I can only describe as professional. I said, "What is your name?" She said, "Ren." I said, "I am Garrett." She looked around the equipment room and then down the corridor toward the main space and then back at me. She said, "You built this yourself?" I said, "Yes." She said, "My dad said most preppers cut corners on the ventilation." I looked at her for a moment. I said, "Your dad was right." She nodded once, as if I had confirmed something she had already decided. And then she looked down at the dog and said, "This is Dust." And that was how it started. Getting her to eat took less negotiation than getting her inside had, which told me she was hungrier than she had let on. Another thing her father had apparently taught her: not to advertise need. I put together what I had that was appropriate for a child and set it on the table and sat across from her while she ate and let the silence be what it was. Dust ate from a bowl I cleaned and filled with dried dog food I had kept in rotation for the working dog I had always intended to get and never had. I kept my questions in their box and thought about the pack against the wall and what it could tell me about where she had come from. I did not say any of that. I waited. She finished eating and she looked at me across the table and she said, "You are not going to ask me anything." It was not a question. I said, "Not yet." She considered that. And then she said, "My dad told me to be careful about who I told things to." I said, "Your dad sounds like a smart man." She looked at her hands on the table for a moment, and something moved across her face that she controlled quickly and completely in a way that no 11-year-old should be able to control that quickly and that completely. I said, "You do not have to tell me anything tonight." She nodded. Then she looked up at me and said, "Are we safe here?" And I said yes, and I meant it. And I watched her receive it and decide to believe it, and the decision cost her something. The particular cost of allowing yourself to feel safe after a long time of not being able to afford it. She was asleep within the hour on the cot I had set up in the secondary storage room, with Dust curled at the foot of the cot and one ear up even in sleep. I stood in the doorway for a moment and then went back to my monitors and ran the perimeter check I had skipped going out to get her. Everything was clear. I sat in my chair and looked at the ceiling and thought about the one-person equations and the arithmetic that had kept me in my chair for 2 years, and I thought about a girl who gave her dog water before she drank. And then on the northern perimeter feed, at the very edge of the camera's range where the tree line thickened before the fence, something moved. Not an animal. The movement was wrong for an animal. Too deliberate. Too still between movements. The specific stillness of something that did not want to be seen. I leaned forward and I watched, and the stillness held. And then the movement came again, and then nothing. And I sat there with my eyes on that feed for a long time, and the northern tree line gave me nothing more. But I had seen it, and whatever it was, it had been standing at the edge of my property in the dark looking toward my compound, and now I had a child asleep inside it, and the arithmetic had just gotten considerably more complicated. I did not sleep that night. That was not unusual. I had nights before Ren arrived where the weight of what I had chosen settled on me in the dark. But this was different. This was not the familiar weight of solitude and moral arithmetic. It was responsibility. Not the abstract kind of keeping my own systems running. That was just logistics. This was the other kind. The kind that has a face. I ran the perimeter check 4 times through the night, and on the third check at around 0300, I thought I saw movement again at the northern tree line. The same position as before, but the feed was inconclusive and the thermal showed nothing definitive, and I sat with it for 20 minutes before filing it as possible and moving on. I checked Ren's door twice. Not to go in, just to stand outside it and confirm the quiet on the other side and the sound of Dust breathing, and let that be what it was. By 0600, I had the morning system checks done and coffee made from the last of my actual coffee stores that I had been rationing into near non-existence, and I was at the table when Ren came out of the storage room with Dust at her heels, her hair still flattened on one side from sleep, and she stopped in the doorway and looked at me, and I slid the second cup across the table, and she looked at it, and then at me, and then she came and sat down. I said, "It is half real coffee and half chicory, so do not get excited." She said, "I know what chicory tastes like." I said, "Of course you do." She drank it without complaint, and I drank mine. And we sat for a while in a silence that was different from the silence of the night before. Less wary, more like two people who had made a provisional decision about each other and were operating within it. I said, "I need to check your exposure levels properly." She said, "My dad showed me how to read the dosimeter." I said, "I know, but I have a reader that gives me more detail than the dosimeter, and I need to know what you have actually absorbed over however long you've been traveling." She considered that, and then she unclipped the dosimeter from where she had reattached it to her jacket overnight and set it on the table between us. I picked it up and read it, and then I got my reader from the medical bay and ran the full assessment. And the number I got was not critical, but it was not nothing, and I sat with that for a moment before I told her the number and what it meant in plain language. She listened to the plain language with the same stillness. She brought everything. And then she said, "My dad said I would be in the acceptable range if I kept moving and checked every 4 hours and stayed out of the hot zones on the map he gave me." I said, "He was right, and you did well. The reading is elevated but manageable, and now that you are inside with filtration, running it will come down." She nodded and took back the dosimeter and reattached it to her jacket with the same economy of motion I had already started recognizing as characteristic. I said, "Can I look at your pack today? Not to take anything, just to understand what you have and what you might need." She looked at me for a moment, and then she looked at dust, and then she said, "Yes." The pack was a masterwork. I want to be precise about that because I have been building and stocking kits for 20 years, and what Ren's father had put together was better than anything I had produced in my first decade of serious preparation, and on a par with my best current work, which is not something I say easily. Every item was chosen with a specific purpose and a secondary purpose, and the weight was distributed correctly, and the medical supplies were appropriate and specific in a way that told me someone had thought carefully about the particular needs of a child traveling alone through a radiation environment. There was a sealed waterproof bag with medications, the right antibiotics, potassium iodide tablets, a small bottle of pain medication, appropriate for a child's weight, antiseptic and wound care supplies. There was a hand-drawn map in a sealed plastic sleeve, detailed and annotated in a small, precise hand, with radiation zones marked and routes indicated, and a series of waypoints that I studied for longer than I let on because what the map told me about the geography of where she had come from was significant. There was a compact multi-tool, a fire kit, a water filtration straw, and a collapsible container, 2 emergency blankets, a small but thoughtfully curated set of tools for minor repairs. There was enough food for approximately 10 days of conservative rationing. The right kinds, the right caloric density, the right packaging for the weight, and at the bottom of the pack, wrapped in a separate waterproof bag inside the main compartment, there were 2 items that I set aside without opening. A sealed envelope, thick enough to contain several pages, with a single word written on the front in the same small, precise hand as the map annotations. The word was "open," and beneath the envelope, wrapped carefully in a cloth that had been laundered and folded with care, a photograph. I did not look at the photograph. I set both items aside and looked at Ren, and she was watching me with her hands around her coffee cup and her eyes doing that assessing thing. I said, "When you are ready to tell me about your dad, I am ready to listen." She looked at the sealed envelope on the table for a moment. She said, "He said to give that to whoever took me in, if they were worth giving it to." I said, "And am I?" She looked at me for a long time. She said, "Dost think so?" I looked at the dog who was sitting between us, looking back and forth between us with an expression of considerable self-satisfaction. I said, "I will take it." She nodded once and went back to her coffee, and I left the envelope on the table and did not touch it, and we finished our coffee. And I started on breakfast, and Dust repositioned himself to a spot where he could monitor both the food preparation and the door simultaneously, which I respected as a tactical decision. I was at the stove when the northern perimeter alarm clicked on. Not the full alarm, the proximity indicator, the outer ring, the first warning. I turned from the stove and looked at the monitor I kept on the counter for exactly this purpose, and the northern feed showed me what I had been seeing in the night. Movement in the tree line, deliberate and still in turns, the specific pattern of someone who knew how to move without being seen and was choosing to be almost seen. Almost. I looked at the indicator for a long moment, and then I looked at Wren, who was watching me from the table with her cup halfway to her mouth and her eyes sharp. I said, "Everything is fine." I turned back to the stove. She said, "What is on the northern feed?" I turned back around and looked at her. She was 11 years old, and she had just asked me specifically about the northern feed, which meant she had clocked the monitor on the counter and identified which camera feed I had been looking at in the approximately 4 seconds I had been looking at it. I said, "You're very observant." She said, "My dad said situational awareness is the most important survival skill." I said, "Your dad was right about a lot of things." She put her cup down and looked at me steadily, and I made a decision about honesty that I have not regretted. I said, "There is someone in the northern tree line. They have been there since last night. They are not approaching, and they have not done anything threatening." She was very still for a moment. Then she said, "How far out?" I told her. She nodded slowly and looked at Dust, who had oriented toward the north wall of the compound with his ears up, and his body language shifted from relaxed to working. She looked back at me. She said, "Okay." And then she said, "What is for breakfast?" And I turned back to the stove, and I made breakfast. And I did not tell her that the way Dust had oriented north told me the dog had known about the Watcher before either of us had said a word. The rest of that day settled into something I had not expected. A rhythm, not my solitary routine, which was efficient and entirely mine, but something with more give in it. Wren was not a difficult presence. She was quiet and self-contained and pulled her weight in the small ways available to her, without being asked, which told me she had been taught that contribution was the price of belonging somewhere. She helped me with the afternoon system checks in a way that made it clear she understood what she was looking at. She did not ask what things were. She asked how they worked and why they had been set up the way they had. And the questions were good questions. I answered them fully because full answers were what she deserved, and because I was learning as much from the questions as she was from the answers. By mid-afternoon, I had a clearer picture of her father than anything she had said about him directly. Built from the pack he had made her and the questions she asked. He was methodical, had been doing this for years before the Cascade the same way I had, and had thought carefully about his daughter's survival as a specific problem with specific requirements. He had taught her well enough that she could ask about ventilation and water filtration and radiation management, and follow the answers with intelligent questions. He had done all of that, and he was not here, and she was 11 years old carrying an envelope on his behalf, and I kept all of that in its box while Dust moved between us with the easy authority of a dog who had decided we were both his people. The northern perimeter indicator stayed quiet through the afternoon. I checked the feed every hour, and the tree line was still and empty in a way that did not entirely convince me it was actually empty. And at 1600, I made a decision and told Wren I was going to do an external check, and that she was to stay inside with the door bolted until I knocked in the pattern I showed her. She said, "I know how to use the rifle on the rack." I looked at her. She said, "My dad taught me." I said I did not doubt it, and that I hoped she would not need to, and I went out through a concealed door and moved north to my own property with the deliberate quiet of someone who had been practicing exactly this kind of movement for 20 years. I covered the northern fence line and found the tree line what I had expected. Compressed ground cover showing someone had stood in one spot long enough to leave a mark, and a departure trail heading north into the deeper tree line. I crouched over it and thought about the envelope on my table and the map in Wren's pack and the waypoints in that small, precise hand. And then I went back inside and knocked, and Wren unbolted the door, and I said, "All clear." She nodded. I could not tell whether she believed me or was choosing to accept it the way she had accepted everything else, as someone to hold carefully until she was ready to do something with it. 3 days passed without the northern perimeter indicator triggering and without me seeing movement on the tree line feed. And I want to tell you that the absence was reassuring. And I want to tell you that I let myself believe it was over, but neither of those things would be accurate. The absence was information the same way presence is information. And what it told me was not that whoever had been standing at my tree line had moved on. It told me they had gotten better at not being seen. I know the difference because I have spent 20 years thinking about the difference, and the difference matters. Someone who has moved on leaves a particular kind of absence. The feed goes back to being just a tree line, just weather and light and occasional animal movement. The natural noise of an environment operating without human interference. What I had on the northern feed for those 3 days was a tree line that was too still. Not dramatically, not obviously. Just slightly more still than the baseline I had been monitoring for 2 years, in the specific way that an environment is still when something in it is being very careful. I logged it, and I watched it, and I did not tell Wren, which was a decision I made consciously and have thought about since. She was settling. That is the only word for what she was doing in those 3 days. Not relaxing exactly, because I do not think relax was a mode available to her after whatever she had been through before she arrived at my tree line, but settling, the way a compass needle settles toward north after you've been moving it around. She was finding her orientation in the compound and in relation to me, and I did not want to disturb that process with information that might be nothing and might be something, and that I was not yet ready to act on. So I watched the feed, and I logged it, and I let her settle, and I kept my protocols running, and I waited. On the morning of the 4th day, she came to breakfast and sat down and looked at the sealed envelope that I had moved from the table to the shelf beside my monitors but had not touched, and said, "I think I am ready." I said, "You do not have to be ready on any particular schedule." She said, "I know, but I am." I got the envelope from the shelf and set it on the table between us, and she looked at it for a moment, and then she picked it up and broke the seal carefully. The way you open something you want to be able to close again. And she took out the pages inside. 4 of them, handwritten on both sides in that same small, precise hand. And she set them flat on the table, and she looked at me and I said, "Do you want me to leave?" She said, "No." So I sat across from her and she read the letter. And I watched her face, and I will tell you what was in the letter, because it is the center of everything, and you need to understand what came after. Her father's name was Dale Mercer. He had been a contractor, not the same work I had done, but close enough that when Wren described what he built and how he thought about it, I recognized the mindset immediately, and he had been preparing for a collapse scenario for 12 years before the Cascade hit. He had a compound of his own, smaller than mine, but well-designed by everything Wren had demonstrated about his thinking, located about 60 miles northeast of my property in a direction that matched the waypoints on the map. He had survived the Cascade in the first year after with Wren, and with a woman named Claire, who had been his partner, and who had died in the second winter from an infection that his medical supplies had not been sufficient to treat, which was a loss I could see in every overspecified item in Wren's medical kit. The ghost of a lesson learned at the worst possible cost. After Claire, he had been alone with Wren for a year, and he had been watching his own radiation readings and managing the compound, and running the same kind of careful solitary operation that I had been running here, 60 miles away, without either of us knowing the other existed. Then his readings had started to change. Not dramatically, not all at once. The same slow creep I monitored on my own sensors every day, the livable zone boundary shifting incrementally in a way that made it easy to rationalize each individual reading, as within the range of normal variation, until you stepped back and looked at the trend over months and understood that the trend was not going to reverse. His compound's position was less favorable than mine, closer to one of the contamination corridors, on ground that the long-term projections did not favor. He had run the numbers for months before he accepted what they told him, and then he had spent the following months preparing Ren for what the numbers meant. He had given her the map. He had built her the pack. He had spent those months teaching her everything he thought she would need, drilling the skills she had, adding the ones she was missing, and he had searched his radio contacts and his pre-Cascade network of people who thought the way he thought until he had found a name and a location that matched the profile he trusted. He had found me, not through any direct contact. I had not been broadcasting, had not been in communication with anyone, but through a network of secondary sources, through people who had known my work and my reputation and my general location, pieced together over months of careful listening on frequencies I had not known were carrying information about me. He had identified my compound as the destination. He had told Ren where to go and how to get there and what to look for. And he had told her that if I was worth trusting, the dog would know before she did. Then he had sent her 60 miles alone through a radiation environment with a pack he had spent months building and a map he had spent months refining and a dog that had been her companion since she was 8 years old. And he had watched her go, and he had not come with her because he could not come with her. His letter explained why. His readings were not just unfavorable. They were already past a threshold that made the journey survivable at his level of exposure. He had been absorbing dose for months longer than Ren, managing it, treating the symptoms with the supplies he had, and the supplies had run out in the way that supplies run out when you are rationing them against a problem that is not getting smaller. He had sent Ren when he still could and had stayed behind because he could not make the 60 miles without exposing her to his pace and his limitations, and he had not been willing to do that. The last page of the letter was addressed to me. It was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph told me who he was and what he had built and what he had tried to do for Ren, and asked me to believe that the preparation she carried was evidence of the love behind it. The second paragraph told me what she needed practically, the specific things, medical and developmental and emotional, that he had identified as her requirements for survival and for becoming the person he believed she was capable of becoming. The third paragraph was 3 sentences. I have read those 3 sentences many times since that morning, and I am not going to reproduce them here because they belong to Ren, and she was the one who had to carry them, and they are not mine to share. What I will tell you is that by the time Ren finished reading, she had not cried. She was the kind of person whose grief went inward rather than outward, the kind of person her father had clearly been. But her hands were flat on the table and very still, and Dust had put his head in her lap, and she had one hand on him without looking down. I sat across from her and did not say anything because there was nothing to say that would have been adequate, and I knew it, and she knew it. And we sat in the quiet of the compound of the ventilation, running its steady filtered breath, and the monitors cycling through their feeds, and the northern tree line sitting in its careful stillness on the screen above my shoulder. After a long time, she looked up at me, and her eyes were dry and level, and she said, "He said you would know what to do." I said, "I will do my best." She nodded. She folded the letter carefully along its original creases, and put it back in the envelope, and held it for a moment, and then set it on the table and slid it across to me. I looked at it and then at her. She said, "He said to give it to you." So, I picked it up and held it, and the weight of it was not the weight of paper. It was the weight of everything Dale Mercer had done and decided and given up, and I held it carefully because it deserved to be held carefully, and I said, "Thank you." She looked at me for another moment, and then she looked down at Dust and scratched behind his ears, and he closed his eyes and leaned into it, and she said, "What is for breakfast?" And I got up and made breakfast because that was what was needed, and because Dale Mercer had sent his daughter to someone he believed would know what was needed, and I was going to be that person. It was the last thing I managed in this compound. The northern perimeter indicator, clicked on while I was at the stove. I looked at the monitor. The movement in the tree line was not subtle this time. I turned the burner down and I crossed the monitor and I looked at the northern feed, and the watcher was at the tree line again, but this time they had moved closer, not to the fence. Not yet, but closer than the previous position, close enough that the camera was giving me more detail than it had before. A figure, adult, wrapped in the kind of layered clothing that someone wears for radiation management in the field, with a pack that was visible even at this distance, and that had a particular shape and configuration that I looked at for a long moment, with something moving in the back of my mind that I could not yet bring forward. The figure was standing still in that deliberate way and looking toward the compound and not advancing. Ren had come to stand beside me at the monitor. I had not heard her move, and I registered that she had a talent for that. The silent repositioning, the sudden presence where there had been none, and I filed it as one more thing her father had apparently taught her. She looked at the screen, and I looked at her face, and her face did something I had not seen it do before. Not fear, not the controlled assessment she brought to everything else. Something more complicated than either. She said, very quietly, "Can you zoom in?" I adjusted the camera, and the figure on the screen became clearer, and Ren looked at it for a long moment. And then she said something that I was not prepared for, and that rearranged every piece of information I had been holding since she arrived at my tree line 4 days ago. She said, "That is my dad's pack." I stood at the monitor and looked at the figure in the tree line. And then I looked at Ren, and Ren was looking at the screen with an expression I did not have a framework for, because it was doing too many things at once, recognition and confusion, and something that was not quite hope, because hope in a post-Cascade world is a thing you learn to keep very small and very protected, and what was on her face was larger than she was allowed herself to let it be yet. She said again, "That is his pack." Her voice was steady, but the steadiness was the kind that cost something to maintain. I looked at the screen, and I looked at the pack on the figure, and I thought about the pack on my table and the pack in Ren's room, and the precise, careful mind that built both of them, and I said, "Are you certain?" She said, "I packed that bag with him. I know every strap on it." I said, "Okay." I said it the way you say something when you need a moment to think, and need the other person to know you have heard them while you take it. I looked at the figure, and the figure had not moved, still standing in that careful, deliberate stillness at the edge of the tree line, close enough now for the camera to give me the shape of a person in layered field clothing with a pack and a face that the camera's resolution was not quite good enough to resolve into details I could read. I thought about the letter. I thought about what Dale Mercer had written about his exposure levels and his readings and the supplies that had run out, and the calculation he had made about the 60 miles between his compound and mine. I thought about a man who had done those calculations carefully and honestly, and had written them into a letter for his daughter to carry to a stranger, and had sent her out into the world on the strength of them. I thought about what it would mean if those calculations had been wrong, or if they had been right and something had changed. I said to Ren, "Stay inside." She looked at me, and I looked back at her, and I said, "I am going out to the northern fence. I need you to stay inside with the door bolted, and dust with you, and I will knock in the pattern when I come back." She looked at the screen for another moment, and then she looked at me and she said, "Bring him in?" She said it with a flatness that was not a request and not a command, but a statement of what was going to happen. The statement of a person who has decided something and needs you to know it has been decided. I said, "Let me see what we're dealing with first." She held my eyes for a moment, and then she nodded once, and I went to the equipment rack, and I suited up properly. Full radiation gear, not the quick jacket I had worn for perimeter check earlier in the week, because whoever was in that tree line had been out in the open for at minimum 4 days that I knew of, and the exposure implications of that were not something I was going to approach unprepared. I went out to the concealed door and moved north through my property with the radiation counter on my belt, and the morning air cold and flat around me, and the tree line ahead getting closer with each step. I could see the figure before I reached the fence, standing at the tree line, maybe 30 feet back from the perimeter, not moving, watching me come. I reached the fence and stopped, and we looked at each other across the distance, and I looked at his face, and I want to tell you that I had prepared myself on the walk over for the range of possibilities, and that I was ready for what I found, but I was not entirely ready. He was upright. He was standing under his own power, and his eyes were clear and tracking, and his pack was on his back the way a man wears a pack when he's been wearing it for a long time and knows how. He was also in worse condition than any person I had seen since the early weeks after the Cascade. The pallor that radiation exposure produces when it's been working on you for months. The particular quality of thinness that is not just caloric deficit, but systemic. The way he held himself upright with a deliberateness that told me it was costing him more than it looked. He had made 60 miles in a condition that his own letter had suggested made 60 miles not survivable, and he was standing at my fence and looking at me with eyes that were doing the same assessing, calculating thing his daughter's eyes did, and I understood in that moment where she had learned it. I said, "Dale Mercer." He said, "Garrett Cole." His voice was steady and even and carried the same quality as his letter. Direct, without performance, a man who said what he meant and did not waste words on what he did not. I said, "Your letter said you could not make the distance." He said, "My letter was honest about my projections." He paused, and then he said, "I have been wrong about projections before." I looked at him for a moment, and then I said, "How long have you been at my tree line?" He said, "For days. I arrived the night Wren did." I looked at the fence between us, and I thought about Dale Mercer standing in the tree line for 4 nights watching the compound where his daughter was sleeping, staying back, not approaching, giving her the space to settle and the time to read the letter and the chance to make the decision about whether I was worth trusting without his presence complicating it. I thought about the discipline that required and the love behind the discipline and the cost of both. I said, "Why did you not come to the gate?" He said, "Because she needed to get there first." I did not say anything to that because there was nothing to add to it. I opened the gate. Getting Dale inside was not the same operation as getting Wren inside had been. Dale walked through the gate and across my property under his own power with his pack on his back and his eyes taking the compound the same way a contractor looks at another contractor's work. Professionally, noting the decisions, assessing the quality. He said nothing until we reached the concealed door, and then he looked at the integration of it into the hillside and said, "Good entry placement," and I said, "Thank you," and we went inside. Wren was in the main corridor 12 feet from the door with dust in front of her, and she was supposed to be in the storage room with the door bolted, but she was 11 years old, and her father was on the other side of the door, and I was not going to hold that against her. Dale came through the door and stopped and looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment that was long enough to have its own weight. And then she crossed the 12 feet, and he crouched down, and she went into him with the particular force of someone who's been holding something together for a very long time, and has finally found a place where they are allowed to put it down. Dust went to them both and pressed his head against Dale's leg. And Dale had one hand on Wren, and one hand on the dog, and he looked up at me over her head with eyes that said everything the situation did not allow him to say out loud. I went to the kitchen end of the main room and started making something hot, because it was what was needed, and because some moments deserve the privacy that a man with his back turned provides. I ran Dale's radiation exposure assessment while the water heated. The numbers were not good. They were not immediately critical in the way that required emergency intervention in the next hour, but they were serious in the way that required serious management, and serious management required resources and planning, and a medical response that was going to be the most demanding thing my medical bay had been asked to do since I built it. I went to medical bay while Dale and Wren were still in the corridor, and went through my inventory against the specific requirements of extended radiation exposure treatment. The picture of what I had and what I needed was workable, not comfortable, not the margin I would have chosen, but workable, which in a post-Cascade compound 60 miles from the nearest anything is a category that matters. I had potassium iodide in quantity, the chelation agents indicated for his exposure level, the supporting medications, the nutritional components, It was going to be a long process, and it was going to consume stores I had not planned for, and the one-person equations were going to need a complete rebuild. I stood in the medical bay and thought about Dale Mercer standing in a tree line for 4 nights watching over his daughter, and I thought about a letter written to a stranger asking him to take care of what mattered most, and I closed the inventory notebook and went back to the corridor. They were sitting on the floor against the wall, Wren tucked under Dale's arm and dust across both their laps, and Dale was talking to her quietly in a way that I did not want to interrupt, and so I went to the kitchen and finished making the hot drinks and brought them over and set them down, and Dale looked up at me and said, "What is the situation with the medical supplies?" I said, "Workable." He looked at me for a moment with those assessing eyes, and then he nodded once. The nod of a man who understands what workable means and what it costs, and who is not going to pretend it is more than it is. He said, "I will contribute what I have in the pack." I said, "We can go through it together?" He said, "Yes." I sat down across from him on the floor, because the chairs felt like the wrong height for the conversation, and Dust repositioned himself to divide his attention evenly between all 3 of us. I said, "You found me through secondary contacts." He said it took 8 months. I said he could have made contact. He said he did not want to risk my security until he was certain. I said he had trusted his daughter to a man he had never spoken to. He said he had trusted her to the compound and the reputation, and the fact that I had been doing this alone for 2 years without losing my head or my principles, which was harder than it sounds. I thought about the people I had watched pass on the road and the arithmetic I had used to justify staying in my chair, and I said, "I'm not certain my principles are as intact as your intelligence suggested." He said, "You went out to get her." I said, "That is one decision." He said, "It is the one that mattered." We sat with that for a moment, and Wren had her eyes closed and her head against her father's shoulder, and Dust was doing his distributed attention management, and the compound was running its steady systems around us. And I thought about the one-person equations and the way the numbers were going to have to change. And I thought about 15 years of building something for a solitude I had been absolutely certain I wanted, and I looked at the 3 of them on my floor, and I thought, with a clarity that surprised me, that the equations had always been wrong. I just had not had the right variables until now. The first 2 weeks with Dale in the compound were the hardest 2 weeks I had experienced since the Cascade, and I want to be precise about why, because it was not what you might expect. It was not the resource strain, though the resource strain was real and required daily management. It was not the adjustment of sharing my space with 2 people after 2 years of solitude, though that adjustment was also real and had its own friction. It was watching Dale Mercer fight his own body for the right to still be in it and not being able to do more than the medical resources allowed, which was less than what the situation deserved and more than nothing, which is the gap that post-Cascade medicine lives in. I ran the treatment protocol I had built for my reference materials, and Dale took everything I gave him without complaint and without drama, and with the same methodical acceptance he seemed to bring to every difficult thing, as if the difficulty was information to be processed and responded to rather than a condition to be resisted. He was not easy to treat because he was knowledgeable enough about his own situation to ask precise questions about every decision I made, and because precise questions from someone in a condition require honest answers, and honest answers about a condition in those first 2 weeks were not comfortable. But I gave him honest answers because he deserved them, and because he was the kind of man who made better decisions with accurate information than with managed information, and the decisions he was making about his own treatment required accuracy. Wren managed those 2 weeks the way she managed everything, with a steadiness that was not the absence of feeling, but the product of having been taught to carry feeling without being carried by it. She was present with her father in the ways that mattered, close, attentive, doing the small, useful things without being asked. And she was present with me in the ways that mattered too, which surprised me and then did not surprise me because she was Dale Mercer's daughter. And Dale Mercer was a man who understood that gratitude was something you showed through usefulness. She helped with the system checks. She helped with the greenhouse. She cataloged the medical supplies with neatness and precision that improved my own system, and she did it without being asked and without making production of it. She and Dust moved to the compound like they had always been in it, like the space had been waiting for them, and I noticed it, and I did not remark on it, because it was the kind of thing that is better observed than named. On the 15th day, Dale sat up in the medical bay without assistance for the first time since he had arrived, and ate a full meal, and kept it down, and his color was something closer to the color of a living person than it had been since I met him. I sat across from him while he ate, and I did not say what I was thinking, which was that 15 days ago, I had not been certain we were going to get to this point, and that the getting to this point had cost my medical stores more than I wanted to admit even to myself, and that the getting to this point was also the most important thing I had done in 2 years. He finished eating, and he looked at me, and he said, "What is the supply situation?" I said, "Manageable." He looked at me the way he looked at everything, and I said, "The medical stores took a hit. I am going to need to think about resupply options." He said, "My compound has stores." I said, 60 miles. He said, "I know the route." I said, "You are not going anywhere for a minimum of another 4 weeks. He said, "I know that too." Then he said, "But after 4 weeks. I said, "We can talk about it after 4 weeks." He said, "Garrett." I looked at him. He said, "I did not come here to be a problem you manage." I said, "You came here because your daughter needed to get here, and you were not going to let her make 60 miles alone without you in the tree line." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "That is also true." I said, "The supply situation is a problem I am interested in solving with you, not for you. There is a difference." He looked at me for another moment, and then he said, "Yes." And the yes had something in it that was not quite gratitude and not quite relief, but was in the neighborhood of both, and I understood it and filed it and moved on, because Dale Mercer was not a man who wanted the moment dwelt on any more than I was. By the end of the first month, we had established a new routine, and the new routine was better than the old one in ways I had not anticipated and would not have predicted from inside the solitude I had been living in. It was better not because 3 people and a dog are more efficient than 1 person in terms of resource consumption. They are not. The math on that is straightforward, but because a compound with 3 people and a dog operates differently than a compound with 1 person in it in ways that are not captured by resource equations. The maintenance gets done faster. The watch rotations mean better rest. The decision-making has the benefit of being tested against another perspective before it gets executed, which catches errors that solitary decision-making produces in ways you do not always notice until they compound. And there is something else that is harder to quantify, but that I notice in myself and that I'm going to try to name accurately, because this account is supposed to be honest. I was better. Not better in the sense of more capable or more prepared. I had been those things alone, and they had kept me alive. Better in the sense of more present. 2 years of solitude produces a particular kind of efficiency that looks like health, but has an edge to it, a narrowing of attention to the immediate and the operational and the logistical. And what happened when Dale and Wren came into the compound was that the narrowing reversed. I started noticing things I had stopped noticing. The way the light changed through the greenhouse panels in the morning. The sound of Wren asking questions and the quality of the questions as they changed over weeks into questions that were better than the questions she had been asking when she arrived. The way Dale looked at a problem, the patience of it, the willingness to sit with incomplete information and not force a conclusion before the information was ready to support one. And what I could learn from that quality by watching it operate in conditions I understood. I started keeping a different kind of log. Not just the system checks and the radiation readings and the inventory counts. Those continued. They will always continue. But a record of what was being built here, in this compound, between 3 people who had each survived the end of the world in their own way and had arrived at the same coordinates from different directions. 6 weeks after Dale arrived, we went through his pack together, at the table the same way. I had gone through Wren's pack on her second morning in the compound. His pack was different from hers in the way a library is different from a field kit. More reference material, more tool variety, more of the long-term planning supplies, and less of the immediate survival gear, which made sense given that he had been operating from a fixed base rather than traveling. There was a radio component that was more sophisticated than mine, and that, when Dale explained his configuration, suggested a capability for directional listening that would significantly improve my intelligence gathering on the regional situation. There were seed varieties I did not have. There were reference materials that duplicated mine in some areas and extended them significantly in others. There was a small sealed case of medications that Dale said he had been saving for the most critical applications, and that, when I opened it and cataloged the contents, accounted for 3 gaps in my own medical inventory that I had been managing around for months. I sat across from him at the table with the contents of his pack between us, and I thought about 2 people 60 miles apart, building the same thing for years without knowing the other existed, and what it said about the way certain kinds of minds approach the same problem, that they arrive at solutions that are compatible enough to combine without friction. Ren was doing homework at the other end of the table. I had started her on a structured curriculum in the second week because it was what she needed, and because I had the reference materials to support it, and because Dale had been too sick to run it himself, and had looked at me when I suggested it with an expression that said everything about what it meant to him that I had thought to suggest it. She looked up from her work and looked at the contents of her father's pack on the table, and then at both of us, and she said, "You are going to be okay," with a flat certainty of someone stating a fact they had decided is no longer open to negotiation. Dale looked at her, and I looked at her, and then we looked at each other, and Dale said, "She does that." I said, "I know." He said, "It is usually accurate." I said, "I have noticed." She had already gone back to her work. Dust was asleep under her chair. Outside the compound, the radiation readings on my rooftop sensors were holding steady in the acceptable range, and the livable zone boundary was where it had been for the past 3 weeks without shifting, and the sky above my 43 acres was the same flat gray it had been since the Cascade. The world was still broken in all the ways it had been broken since the night the control systems failed and took everything down with them. None of that had changed. None of that was going to change on any timeline that my planning horizon could reach. But inside the compound, the ventilation was running clean, and the stores were stocked to a level that 3 people and a dog could sustain for longer than any of us had been sustaining alone. And there was a curriculum on the table, and a dog under a chair, and a man across from me who had walked 60 miles in a condition that his own calculations said should have stopped him, because his daughter was at the end of those 60 miles, and some calculations are not the ones that matter. I had built this compound to disappear from the world. I had built it to be invisible, self-contained, sufficient unto itself, a solution to a problem that I had framed as a solitary one. I had been wrong about the framing, not about the preparation. The preparation had worked. The compound had held. The 15 years of building had been the right 15 years. But the framing, a compound is not a solution. It is a foundation. What you build on it is up to what you are willing to let in. I had let in a child and a dog and a man who had trusted me with both, and I had rebuilt my equations from scratch around the 3 of them, and the equations were harder now and more complicated, and required more variables and more maintenance, and more of everything that I had spent 2 years conserving by keeping them simple. They were also, for the first time since I sealed the gate and killed the lights and disappeared from the world, the right equations.